Hello and welcome to this new video in which you will learn how to create this super cool 3D animation effect that you might be familiar with if you have an Apple TV. And all you need is a little bit of HTML, CSS and JavaScript. So let's get started. Alright, so welcome back. So as you can see on the left side, this is what we're going to create, right? It's a page with a couple of movie posters. I'm a huge Star Trek fan, so I just picked a couple of Star Trek movies from back then, from 1987 to 2021. Essentially, the layout is like you have a couple of rows, right, with those images, and once you hover with your mouse pointer over one of the posters, it's going to create this pretty cool 3D effect. Now we're not going to create this effect on our own. We're actually going to use a library which is called Atropos. It's pretty new, but I think it's pretty cool. It's from the same guys who created Swiper.js and Framework 7, so you can be sure it's working well, and it's actually very easy to use. But first things first, what we're going to do is we create a new project, right? And I used just create React app for this one. So this is a pretty much empty application. And if you want to do the same thing, just run this npx command and you can get started with an empty React app. So first things first, we're going to start with an empty project. And this one here, I'm just going to start using Yarn, okay? You don't have to use Yarn. It's my preferred tool. You can also use npm or whatever you want. But as you can see, once it's started, it's just showing this hello world text here, because that's all that I have in my project right now, right? So if you're familiar with React, you will probably understand this line, right? It's just a little bit of JSX code, and that's it. We pretty much have no CSS code yet, because as I said, this is an empty project. So what we're going to do now first is actually install Atropos. So it could be as easy as running yarn add and then Atropos, and then it will install that dependency and add it to your package.json. So that's that. Now we have to import it, right? Quite simple. I just open my index.js file, and I'm going to go Atropos/CSS, and that's pretty much it. Now I've imported my CSS styles for Atropos, and I'm going back to my app.js file. If you have actually struggled to follow along, or if you're wondering how all this stuff works, I'm going to upload that this project to my GitHub repository, and I'm going to link it in the descriptions below. So just check out the URL, and you can see all the code we are going to write today. So going back here in my app.js file, we need to import a couple other stuff, right? Because we're using React, and we also need the React version of Atropos. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to import two hooks here. One is use state, and the other one is use effect. As I said, if you're familiar with React, you should know these. If you don't, I highly recommend to familiarize yourself with these, as they're super important for React development. All right. Next, so I don't know if you remember, but in our user interface, we had different ranges of years, right? So we started in the year 1987 to 2000. So that was the first row of posters. And then there was another row, I think it was from 2000 to 2009. And the last row of images was from 2010 to 2021. So I'm going to just define those ranges like that. I'm just call them start. So we start in 1987, and the first row is going to end in 1999. And then we have the second row, which is from 2000 to 2009, and from 2010 to 2021. So if you're wondering why I chose 1987, so that's actually the time frame when I started to watch Star Trek. And this is kind of the next generation era, and I'm not a Kirk era guy. I'm kind of too young for that, I guess. Anyhow, so let's go back to application. This hello world stuff we can actually get rid of, right? We don't need that, so I'm just gonna use an empty div for now. And we need a list of movies, right? So I have something prepared for that. And what we're going to have is an array actually of movies. So we are going to define an empty array right here. And in our project, I've put a JSON file, and in just JSON file, we have all the data we need for our movies, right? So the first one is called here Star Trek Prodigy. It shows when it first debuted, and it also has an image for the poster. And the whole file is filled with movie data. And so I'm just going to use this to fill my app. In theory, you can also use an API, like, I don't know, like OMDB or Rotten Tomatoes, whatever you want. I'm just going to pretend that my JSON file here is like an API. So what we have to do now is we have to fill actually our array with our data, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to define a new function. It's going to be asynchronous because we're going to do a fetch call with this within this function. And we call fetch, and simply on that JSON file, right? So that's this one here. And then we need to convert the result to actually JSON, or actually to an JavaScript object literal. So that's what .json is going to do. And then I call set movies. So I want to use the result and put it into a right state. Right? So I'm just going to call restjson.movies. Why.movies? Well, the data starts with an with an attribute called movies. That's why. Alrighty. So far so good. So when do we actually call this function? We want to call this once the application starts, right? So for this, we need the effect that we have imported here. So I'm going to call use effect like that. I'm going to pass an empty array because I only want this to be run once. And all I'm going to do here is just call getData, which takes the data from our JSON file and puts it into our state. Let's have a look at our actually markdown, right? So what we want is we want a title. Actually, I think it needs to be in brackets like that. I'm just going to call this, I don't know, Star Trek movies show or something like that. And now we're going to use this range array here, because essentially we want to create a new row for each range. So what I'm going to do here is inject a little bit of JavaScript code, and I'm going to go through each item in the range array, and I'm going to map it like that. And what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to call a function which we call render range. So we have not defined this function yet. But essentially what we wanted to do is we wanted to take the data and render that row, okay? So I'm going to pass it the movies that we want to render. We want to pass it when the range starts and the end of the range. like that. So it's now complaining that render range does not exist yet, right? So all we do now is we have to define this function, right? So I'm gonna go ahead and define this function, and it's gonna get movies start and end as a parameter. Whoops. So you don't have to use an array function if you don't want to. This is just a matter of taste. And one row is going to just be a div. So I'm going to call this just row. And we want to give it a title. So each row we want to show the range that we've defined earlier, right? So I'm going to show just the year, so the start year and the end year. And then another div, like that. I'm going to get the class name because we need to style this later, right? So I'm just going to call this movie list like that. And within this, we have to render all our movies, right? So we need to put in a little bit of JavaScript code again. And for each of these movies items, we first need to filter them because we only want movies for a certain range. So I'm going to call filter. And for each movie, so M stands for movie, okay? You want to check, is it older or newer than our start date? And is it older or newer than our end date, right? We only want to see the movies which fit into this range, right? Next, we do some method chaining here. So we're going to call sort because we want our movies to be sorted in the right order. So if we compare two movies, then we need to compare actually the year of those two movies, right? So I'm going to call parseInt for each of the years. So m1.year, whoops, and m2.year. So you might be wondering, hey, why are you calling parseInt? It's quite simple. The data here, it's all strings, right? So the year is a string, and parseInt will convert that string into a number. All right, so far so good. And the last one is we need to actually render how a movie looks like, right? So we're gonna simplify things a little bit. Whoops, that's not right. Need to go here. So we're gonna map it, and we're gonna need to define a new function which we call render movie. So this is not defined yet, so my IDE is complaining here. So let's define that function, render movie. Like that. And now we have to tell it how we want our movie to look, right? So again, a little bit of JSX code. And now this is where the magic actually comes into place, how we create that crazy animation that we've seen earlier. Well, it's not that crazy, but it looks pretty neat. And for this, we need Atropos. So luckily, we have already imported Atropos at this point, so we can use it. And what we need to do is we need to wrap each of our poster images into an own Atropos instance. So it's called Atropos. It needs a key. This is not Atropos specific. This is something that React actually needs. So as a key, we're just going to use the title of our movie right here. And I'm going to call this Atropos, like that. And now within our Atropos instance, we need to define the image, actually the poster of the movie that we want to show. So I'm going to call this class name poster image. I'm going to set the source. m.poster, and usually your browser also wants an alt, so I'm gonna just use the title here. And there's another option which I'm gonna explain to you guys in a second, but we need this for Atropos. And this actually allows you to define how strong or how weak you want that effect to be. So I'm going to set it to -3 for now, but feel free to play around with this value. All right, so far so good. I'd say let's just start this thing up, shall we? So yarn start. Okay, not too bad actually. So as you can see, we have now rendered all our images. And if I hover with my mouse cursor over one of these items, it already does this funky animation that we want, right? But the layout is still not right. So we need to add a little bit of CSS, not that much, in order to make this look good. So the first one is in our root element, we're just going to add a little bit of padding, right? So this will create a nice padding around the whole thing. Save it like that. And next one is I want my heading over here to look a little bit nicer. So I don't like the way it looks. The font is a little bit too thick for my taste. So I'm going for font weight 300. And I'm also going to change the font for the subheadings. So these are the subheadings, right, for each range. And I'm going to give it a margin bottom, whoops, of 300. Sorry, that's too much. 10 pixels. And also font weight of 300. Like that. So now we have a lot nicer looking, thinner font going on here. Next, we need to actually define how we want our row to look like. So we want to span it 100% width. And we're just going to add a little bit of padding in order, to make everything look a little bit nicer, a little bit more fluffy. Like that. Save it. Pretty good. Next thing, we want everything to be in one row, right? So currently it's kind of aligned vertically. So what we're going to do is we give our movie list wrap element display flags. Like that. And now everything is aligned horizontally. So this looks already very similar to that what we actually want, right? But there's still a little bit of adjustment that we can do. It's just eye candy, but I really like to mess around with a little bit of CSS here. So remember that we have defined the Atropos class name on each of these posters. So we're going to use that to select it within CSS. And I just want a little bit, I want everything to be a little bit smaller. And, just the same width and height. Save it like that. And now I'm going to add a little bit of border radius. Why? Well, because we can. Save it. All right, so I'm just going to increase the zoom in my browser a little bit so you can actually see what's going on. And as you can see now in the top right corner here where my mouse pointer is, it has this nice looking border radius now. We want everything to be a little bit more, further apart from each other. So I'm gonna set a margin right of 30 pixels, which is going to create this gap between each poster. And last but not least, so if you hover over each item, it looks already pretty good, right? But what I wanted to create a little bit more depth. And that's actually a trick for that. So I'm going to call Atropos shadow. This is an element which already exists and which creates a shadow around each of those posters. And I'm just going to change the background color of this one to 262626, and I need to override it, so that's why I need to set it to important and save it. And I don't know if it's visible, but right around that poster there's now a little bit of drop shadow, like a light gray drop shadow when I hover over it, which creates a little bit of depth. Now if you want to make this a little bit more visible, just change it to white, and now see this is actually the shadow that we're talking about. But obviously this is a little bit too much, so I'm going to stick with 262626. Right. Yeah, so that's what you want. And that's actually the final result. Right, so this is our application. Animation looks great. Layout is fine. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed this episode. And you're going to give Atropos a try. Just go to AtroposJS.com. The documentation is quite short, but they have actually all you need to get started. And as I said earlier in my video, I'm going to post all my source code in my GitHub repository. So check out the descriptions below, and see you next time for the next video. Bye bye.